My name is Richard Poe, and I'll be your host. Today we begin a course entitled Liberty and Its Price, Understanding the French Revolution. Your professor is Donald M.G. Sutherland, a professor of history at the University of Maryland in College Park, Maryland. He has shared the Corrin Prize, awarded by the Society for French Historical Studies for the best article in a given year. He has received a number of other awards and fellowships, such as the Guggenheim Fellowship for 2001-2002. For more information on this course, please visit its webpage at www.modernscholar.com, where you'll have access to links to related sites, a seminar room to share your thoughts with other students, and yes, of course, a final exam. And now we begin Liberty and Its Price, Understanding the French Revolution. Lecture 1. Definition of Revolution. And now, Professor Sutherland.
The French Revolution is enormously complicated, and students coming at it for the first time are understandably very baffled. There's the extraordinary violence that ties the period together from 1789 to 1815. Wars, insurrections, revolutions, coups d'etat. There's a huge turnover of personnel. In the 1790s especially, there's almost one new ruling clique per year, with the requirement on the part of the student to memorize it all. Then, in addition to that, to add total confusion, the revolutionaries changed the calendar, so that it's no longer possible to mark time in a way that we can understand. Instead, we have to deal with a foreign language with Roman numeral years in a decimal metric calendar to try and make sense of it all. We have to translate time back into our Gregorian time, and that adds to the confusion. The French Revolution, on the other hand, is understandable if one realizes that it all can be boiled down, it seems to me, to three questions. The answers to the questions take much longer, but the questions themselves add a certain organizing principle to all the material. What caused the French Revolution? What caused the terror? Are these the same things? What caused the revolution based on liberty and constitutionalism to slide into Napoleon's dictatorship? The attractive part of the three questions is that they keep the paradox of the French Revolution alive. How do we deal with a society that moves from the principles of 1789 to the high ideals of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which we would recognize, of freedom, freedom of religion, religious toleration, rights to property, liberty, assembly, press, and so on? How do we move from 1789 to the guillotine, to the tumbril, to the revolutionary tribunals of the West, where a trial could take less than 20 seconds to decide, where there was no appeal against a decision, where an appeal had to be carried out within 24 hours and could at times be carried out within 5 minutes? How do we move from 1789 to 1794? And after 1794, how do we move into the dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte? And what does that mean? Frequently, Napoleon is treated as a subject of biography. It is the ultimate Napoleonic conceit that the biography of the great man is conflated into the history not only of France, but the whole of Europe. The understanding is that if you understand Napoleon's personal biography, his power relationships, his relationships with women, his relationships with other European monarchs, then one therefore understands the history of the whole period. But if we look at Bonapartism and the phenomenon as a dictatorship, we can tie it to the revolution. How does a revolution based on liberty and constitutionalism slide into the dictatorship of one man? Note, I have not said a military dictatorship, because it wasn't. Napoleon insisted that his was a civilian dictatorship and that he ruled as a civilian, and that's why he was adored. I think that is correct. Before we can answer the questions about cause of 1789, cause of terror, cause of Bonaparte, we have to establish some definitions. It might seem obvious that we all know what a revolution is, But unless we are clear about the definition, an unspoken definition, an unspecified definition will lead us in certain directions. Unless we can decide what was revolutionary about the French Revolution, we will rather unconsciously drift around in the narrative. Defining what was revolutionary can affect the choice of what to talk about, and it can affect how we place the revolution in European history. Let me give you an example of what this can mean about definition and how we define. The classic definition of the French Revolution is a Marxist one, which we'll see later has considerable explanatory power, is a Marxist definition that places its emphasis upon class and class relations. In that narrative, there's a great deal of emphasis placed upon social structure, social movements, violence from below, and so on. Mere events or biography count less. And when I was a graduate student, we were all working on the unspoken assumption that the king himself, Louis XVI, had only a peripheral relation with the ultimate meaning of the revolution. On the other hand, the Marxist revolution has now gone into great eclipse. Practically no one accepts it any longer. So we need a new definition about what is revolutionary about the revolution. And what a lot of historians have come up with is to place Louis XVI, the king, at the center of events. And that the climax of the revolution is now the trial of Louis XVI in December 1792, January 1793. The apex of the entire period occurred at 10:20 in the morning of 21st of January 1793, when the revolutionaries executed Louis XVI. The execution of the king, therefore, becomes pivotal in defining what the revolution was about. It was regicide. That is the meaning of the revolution. That, in turn, if that is the definition of revolution, if regicide is the definition of revolution, then that affects our research agenda. Because then we go back into the 18th century and look for signs of weakness in the monarchy. That has had a very salutary effect in the past 20 years, rehabilitating the political history of the 18th century. But it has also led to a very large claim that the monarchy was very weak on the eve of 1789. And the phrase used is desacralization, that the monarchy had lost the religious patina that it had shared or it had participated for centuries because of the decadence of Louis XV and because of the inanity of Louis XVI and his relationship with Marie Antoinette. The monarchy was desacralized, its religious gloss removed, and as a result, it could be attacked in 1789, and we're not very far in 1789 from the tumbrils of January 1793. So how we define what is revolutionary about the revolution affects the things we talk about, and also about the research agenda that we set for ourselves. Contemporaries had a definition of revolution which is interesting to explore. Given 18th century beliefs about revolution, a revolution in 1789 in a country like France was unthinkable. It could not occur because the concept did not exist. The old regime definition of revolution involved any sudden change in the state. That meant that coup d'etat could be thought of as a revolution. The best example of that would be Catherine II of Russia overthrowing her husband, the Tsar Peter III, in 1760, and probably murdering him in 1762. That, at the time, was described as a revolution. What contemporaries meant by the word revolution was any sudden or unexpected change in the political order of things. That's an implication that is still with us. But we go further. We think of a revolution as a violent overthrow of the existing order. It has to be violent, it has to have this element of overthrow, and it has to be rapid. No definition in any European dictionary contains those elements before 1789. The modern definition of 1789 dates from 1789 itself. People did not intend for the revolution to occur. The understanding of the revolution in the modern sense came after, when people tried to make sense. People from the beginning tried to make sense of the French Revolution. Some of the earliest people to make sense of the French Revolution were, in fact, counter-revolutionaries. Some of these were displaced clerics or dislodged counter-revolutionaries or ideologues who blamed the Enlightenment of the 18th century for the revolution. This is an understandable step for them to take because the revolutionaries thought of themselves as the descendants of the enlightened philosophers, so the revolutionaries themselves claimed affiliation. The counter-revolutionary writers went further and saw the Enlightenment as the result of a plot, or the consequence of the Enlightenment was a plot against monarchy and church, to undermine the monarchy, to undermine the church. It was a vast conspiracy organized by Freemasons. This culminated in the early part of the 20th century in a book by a now almost forgotten writer by the name of Augustin Cochin, who wrote a book about what were called the free thought societies in 18th century Brittany, in which he said the revolution in Brittany was carried out by a conspiracy within a conspiracy. The inner conspiracy was what Cochin called the machine. The proof of the machines, then the machine is supposed to have operated in such a way as to influence the people on the outer edges of the conspiracy, who then in turn influence the society as a whole. But it's all animated by this very mysterious central machine. The proof that the machine existed, according to Cochin, was there's no evidence for it. The machine covered its tracks so successfully that one can only trace the activities of the outer conspiracy, not the inner conspiracy. The French Revolution as a conspiracy goes back a long way to the revolution itself, and still one can find this in writings as late as the early 20th century. There are others who try to make sense of the French Revolution, the great kaleidoscope of events at the time, which has a Marxist gloss, but it was written before Marx was actually born. The person who's most responsible for this is a French revolutionary politician himself called Antoine Barnave, who saw the revolution as the logical consequence of a change in property relations. He saw the revolution as representing the triumph of commercial capitalism over feudal landed aristocracy. One can see why this would be attractive to the young Marx. It was also attractive to many other writers, early writers of the 19th century, Mania, Thiers, and then Marx himself. For the Marxists, refined this into the idea of the rise of the bourgeoisie. The French Revolution is as a result of the rising bourgeoisie, which had begun centuries before, and 1789 represents the ultimate triumph of the bourgeoisie, or the middle class capitalists, who overthrow a feudal and decadent aristocracy. And thus, 1789 is the pivot on which Europe transitioned from a feudal to a capitalist order, when aristocratic society gave way to the plutocracy. In brief, when an old, decrepit world crumbled before the new. The idea of the French Revolution as a bourgeois revolution has had a long history. It survived and still survives among some people, but it was questioned in the 1960s, a phenomenon we'll come to. But the idea of the French Revolution as being a bourgeois order actually answers our three questions about cause, about terror, about Napoleon. Because 1789 is the bourgeoisie throwing off its feudal fetters, pulling aside the chains that have bound it down for centuries, and establishing a new order. The terror is the result of the bourgeoisie defending itself against counter-revolution. And Bonaparte is necessary because the bourgeoisie was coming under threat from abroad and from royalists, and the bourgeoisie turned to the providential man whose military dictatorship, they always say military dictatorship, preserved the new class relations that 1789 inaugurated. Once the Allies finally defeated Napoleon at Waterloo in June 1815, France could resume its more normal course of a liberal constitutional monarchy. So the answer to the three questions for the Marxists is the bourgeoisie. if one wants to answer that question in far less even than 25 words. This is a very powerful interpretation. It was dominant until the 1960s, when an American historian named George Taylor published a blockbuster article in which he showed the assumption behind the argument is empirically false. The argument about bourgeois versus aristocrat depends upon the notion that there's a difference between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. That the bourgeoisie is capitalistic, financial, commercial, industrial on the one side, the aristocracy is landed and feudal on the other. It's not true. There are many aristocrats who invest in capitalistic enterprises like the slave trade, like mines, forests, industrial activities, and so on. There are many bourgeois who own land, who own their positions, who invest in very non-capitalistic forms of income generation, like bonds, which pay a very, very small amount of money, and so on. There's no difference in investment patterns between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. Now, if there is no difference between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy, what are we to do with this notion of feudal transition? Not much. In fact, Taylor's thesis led to a long period of frustration among historians in which the effect of exploding the Marxist paradigm did not automatically insert another one in order to understand it. Moreover, this continued for quite some time, although a solution is always on the horizon. Part of the Marxist paradigm is that the bourgeoisie was frustrated with the aristocracy. The crisis of the French Revolution is a crisis of social mobility. Contemporaries themselves talked about this, that they themselves talked about how non-titled middle-class people were frustrated in the old regime in their advancement, in their desire to advance. It's a fact that in the old regime, all the major institutions of society are dominated by the aristocracy. The episcopate, the diplomatic corps, the army, the navy, the judges, the ministers, with a few exceptions, and so on, are all blue bloods. So the idea that ambitious people were held back because they were not nobles was very attractive. Unfortunately, some other investigation has shown that the confluence between ambition and frustration is not identical. How could one become a noble in the old regime? One could become a noble by inheriting it. One could become a noble by having the title granted by the king. But above all, one could buy the title. One did this in the old regime through the device known as venal office. One could buy an office in the administration. Many thousands of offices were on the block. Private people owned their jobs in the government administration. Some of these positions conferred personal and later hereditary nobility on the holder. A person could therefore buy a title. Venality of office, according to William Doyle, was the device by which the ambitious could rise in the society over a long period. One simply had to work one's way up the hierarchy of venal office until one transitioned into the nobility through venal office, and then all the things that came to traditional nobles were conferred upon that family. The effect of venal office was to make the French aristocracy a young aristocracy. Most aristocrats like to pretend that their titles went way back, and indeed some spent quite some time forging a fake genealogy for the family. The reality is that a majority of French aristocrats in 1789 had probably held their titles for less than 250 years. They were a young aristocracy, and they were also rich, because one could not climb the venal office tree unless one had the money to do so. This points in the direction of a more sophisticated interpretation of why the French Revolution. Now, alongside this and parallel with this, the interpretation was put forward by a recently deceased French historian by the name of François Furet, who accepted all the Anglo-Saxon, the Taylor thesis, the anti-Marxist version, and he tried to answer this question of what propelled the French Revolution, If it's not class struggle, what could it possibly be? Fourier opted for ideology. Fourier said that what drove the French Revolution was a particularly utopian ideology derived from the 18th century philosophers who themselves tended to be rather utopian because the old regime marginalized intellectuals. So they tended to be dreamers. This is a point that Alexis de Tocqueville also put forward. So that what drove the revolution was ideology. Ideology, in turn, answers two of our questions, 1789 and also the terror, because the terror is the consequence of the utopian ideology put into practice. Marxists saw the terror as defensive. Fourier sees the terror as the attempt to impose utopia. Fourier goes on. He insists upon the primacy of politics, a politics driven by ideology. Class no longer matters. He says in one of his writings that the social structure of France of the 1830s was not very different from the social structure of France in the 1780s. Therefore, the sociological approach is not going to take us very far in understanding what's happening with the French Revolution. He says that the collapse of 1789 was so complete that nothing remained to constitute the social order, nothing but a language of extreme utopianism. Terror was an attempt to construct a paradise on earth. It was a consequence of the utopianism that was implicit in the ideals of 1789. Far from inaugurating an era of pluralistic politics, far from being modern, the revolution was merely the first, according to Fourier, of the terrible gulags, the ethnic cleansings, the mass purges, and the killing fields of our time. It's obvious that Fourier saw 1789 through the lens of 1917 or even 1936. Fourier was himself a former communist. He came to the French Revolution later in life after disillusionment with communism in 1956 and the Hungarian Revolution. He became a journalist, although he had very many academic qualifications to go along with it, and then rediscovered the French Revolution in a dispute with the then chair of the French Revolution at the Sorbonne, a communist intellectual by the name of Albert Saboul. A great deal of what Fourier wrote was anti-Saboulian, anti-communist, anti-Soviet, and he saw the French Revolution as a dress rehearsal for Stalin and the gulags. For me, Fourier is in many respects a very attractive, very interesting, very engaging historian, but it seems to me that he flies too high over the material. To see 1789 as telescoping into 1917 is a rhetorical point. It doesn't seem to help us very much in understanding what we need to know about the coming of the French Revolution itself. A nuts and bolts investigation of the human experience of these years shows there was nothing inevitable about 1789, that ideology had a role in the French Revolution but did not drive it, and that terror can be understood in a multifaceted way, not simply as a single cause, as a result simply of ideology, let alone the dictatorship. And Fourier had very little to say about the dictatorship. For me, there's no hidden, beneath the surface engine driving the French Revolution to catastrophe. The period is best understood as a lesson in the unfortunate consequences of good intentions. For me, the three questions are largely separate. Again, let me give you an example of what I mentioned before about how unacknowledged assumptions about the revolution can lead us in certain directions which we wouldn't necessarily want to go. There's a very famous book, a book I actually admire a great deal, about the French Revolution by Simon Schama, a professor at Columbia University, called Citizens, and the experience of the French Revolution. And Schama has outraged many of my colleagues by saying that the violence of 1789 and the violence of 1793 are exactly the same. That the street violence in Paris in 1789, the lynching, the beheadings, are simply another version, as he says, with a lower body count than the terror itself. This is to define terror as popular violence from below. If one wants to do that, that's a possibility, and it contributes towards the understanding, but it doesn't understand terror as such. Terror is much more than violence from below. Indeed, there's very little violence from below during the actual period of the terror itself, perhaps for good reason. Terror itself is sponsored by the revolutionary political class, defined by the revolutionary political class, implemented by those people, and ultimately comes apart because of decisions they made. Violence is, of course, a major feature of the period of the terror, but the context in which the terror occurs is the most interesting, much more interesting part, which we were going to have to get to. Contemporaries were well aware that drastic changes were necessary in government and society. For me, again, I've emphasized a great deal about how you define the revolution, what's revolutionary about the revolution affects how you see it. I should lay my cards on the table. What's revolutionary about the French Revolution is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen that was passed on the 26th of August, 1789. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen qualifies the French Revolution as modern, whatever happened since. It decouples it completely from the Soviet experience of 1917, 1939, or beyond. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen is recognizable to all Americans because it is not very different from American ideals, nor should that be a surprise, because a consultant on the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen was the American resident in Paris at the time, Thomas Jefferson. If you read Jefferson's writings and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, you will recognize an uncanny similarity. And that similarity is understandable when you realize that Jefferson had a big influence over it. The Declaration defines civil and political rights that we all take for granted. Liberty, freedom of conscience and association, religious tolerance, rights of property, due process of law, and so on. It was very revolutionary in its social context. It specifically says that the new government is granting freedom of conscience in all matters, even in religion. Up until that time, the Catholic Church had had a monopoly on public religious expression. One barely had until very recently, till 1787, Protestants did not have anything that could be remotely recognized as civil rights, nor did France's small community of Jews. The Declaration of Toleration undermined the Catholic monopoly on freedom of worship and pushed the Catholic Church to one side. It did not, however, separate church and state. French revolutionaries would have been horrified at the idea of separating such a powerful institution of the Catholic Church from the tutelage of the state. What they intended to do was to associate the church with the state in a common enterprise of social order. It's also very revolutionary in its insistence upon liberty, because up until the 1780s, 1788 being the last year, the French monarchy had deployed this wonderful device that we all wish we probably had privately of a lettre de cachet. This is a device through which you were allowed to sign off on having any enemy imprisoned without a trial. Many people in the Bastille were there because they had been put there by their families because they didn't trust the young man to look after the family patrimony. The government's ability to detain at will in the lettre de cachet came to an end. A National Assembly would meet to vote on the budget and the level of taxes. This is something the French monarchy had never allowed up until that time, when all legislative power was in the hands of the king, and the king decided the level of taxes. And as late as 1786, 1787, as we shall see, the monarchy was making the claim that it alone could decide taxes in the future. The law would also treat everyone equally. The special privileges of the nobility would disappear. The special privileges in terms of taxes and the special privileges in terms of claims on public office would disappear, to be replaced by equal access based upon merit and equality of opportunity. It's important to stress that the monarchy, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, nor the Constituent Assembly did not abolish monarchy in France. They abolished absolute monarchy. They made the monarchy accountable to a legislative institution, but it was felt that Louis XVI would be a loyal constitutional monarch. And one of the reasons for the turmoil that came about between 1789 and 1792 was the king's faithless failure to live up to his role as a constitutional monarch. The nobility was also to have a role in the sense that individual nobles were not to be persecuted. Noble privileges were to disappear, but they were to be citizens like everybody else. Even when the Constituent Assembly abolished the institution of nobility, nobles themselves survived. Indeed, it's paradoxical that the French Revolution, which is full of anti-aristocratic rhetoric, the vast majority of nobles did survive into the 19th century. And indeed, if you care to look it up in various phone books in France, you can find very many famous names still in the Paris phone book. None of this predicts the future. If what's revolutionary about the French Revolution is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, we're further away from our question about what caused the terror. In my view, what caused 1789 is not the same as the conjunction of events that caused the terror. What causes the terror is a particularly acute series of events, of confluences of events and forces that come together to produce the terror. No one in 1789 could foresee, as Wordsworth called, in that blissful summer of 1789, no one could foresee the execution of Louis XVI, his blood splashed all over the deck of the guillotine on the what is now the Place de la Concorde in January 1793. Nor could anyone foresee the ferocious de-Christianization campaign whose purpose was to eradicate from the very psyche of the nation all reference to France's Christian past and Christian present. No one could foresee the attempt to refashion the human personality through violence and the guillotine and shock of exemplary punishments. No one could see this in 1789. No one could see in 1789 the dictator of 1799. It's often said that the dictator was foreseen, that Edmund Burke predicted the military takeover of 1789 when he referred to the revolution as going to fall into the hands of the man on horseback. The man on horseback is not Bonaparte. In 1790, when Burke wrote those words, the man on horseback was quite clearly the Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of two worlds, the hero of the American Revolution, and the hero, to some degree, of 1789, and one of the drafters of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It's a sign of how much things had changed in 1793 and 1794 that Lafayette was not only marginalized in politics, he was a prisoner of war in Austria at the time. All this is to run ahead of the story. One way to ask the question about the causes of the French Revolution, to answer the question of the causes of the French Revolution, is to reformulate the question. What caused the French Revolution can be reformulated as, why did the men who drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man embrace the principles of 1789? Why had absolute monarchy and hereditary privilege become so dangerous that the nation needed to reformulate the policy? Why was it that a monarchy that had survived for 1,400 years in absolute, more or less absolute form, why had a society based upon privilege and birth and the claims to hierarchy, why had a society in which one church, one version of Christianity had an absolute monopoly, why had this ceased to be satisfactory by 1789? What had changed to alter the loyalty of people to a history that was, after all, 1,400 years old? In the next lecture, we'll try to answer these questions. Why it was that a monarchy that had lasted for so long, in such a basically unchanged form and certainly largely unchanged principles, why this had come to be unsatisfactory.
This ends Lecture 1.